All right, let's talk about recruiting a little bit. So, top 10 recruits in the state of Florida. So, now listen, the list that we're referring to removes IMG guys that are from out of state, okay? Because essentially that's like a boarding school that's here. But anyway, top 10 Florida recruits from the state, all signed in the SEC. Now, UF picked up 4 of them. 2 of those are UF legacies in Hanks and Vernell Brown III. And so I do think Florida, obviously had a little bit of an in with both of them. However, lots of programs made huge pushes for them, and top 10 in the state, they are obviously weighing their options. But let's run down the list. So LSU snagged 2, Florida snagged 4, Texas snagged 2, Bama snagged 1, Missouri snagged 1 as well. The interesting thing about this list, I don't know if it's more interesting to me that Florida got 4 of the top 10, or it's more interesting to me that Florida State and Miami, particularly Miami, coming off of the season that they're coming off of, snagged none.
Yeah, the fact that Florida State's not on this list doesn't surprise me at all, right? When you factor in they essentially only really had a chance with maybe 8 of them, like with the couple of Florida legacies that were on there. And then they went 2-10, right? Like how many top 10 recruits are you pulling as a terrible football team? Not many, right? But Miami not being on here is huge. One of these guys, one of these flipped from Miami. They were certainly in on others. They were, DJ Pickett, number 1. They really thought they had a chance there, and LSU ended up holding on to him. They thought they had a chance with Hilson, who ended up at Missouri. They thought they had a chance with other, maybe flipping Vernell Brown, even though I never really thought that was a possibility. But yeah, I think that Florida State not being on there to me is not a surprise at all. Miami not being on it at all is a surprise. I mean, they just had a 10-win season in which they were, I like to crack on Miami as much as we can. We'll do that in a minute more, but
absolutely.
I mean, they were not even percentage points. They lost on the 5th tiebreaker of not making the ACC championship. And so essentially it came down to a crazy tiebreaker scenario for them to not make the ACC, in which they likely go out and win the thing and go to the playoff. And still,
they had a decidedly best season out of any of the teams in the state of Florida. They beat both Florida and Florida State. They don't play Florida particularly often, so they, they have the state title, and this is the best season they've had in a long time, and not a whole lot to show for it. If Miami, the motto for Miami has always been that they could just recruit Miami-Dade, right, and they could win a national title. So the fact that they've prided themselves on locking down the state of Florida, and the fact that they can't lock down the state of Florida in a year where they are decidedly the best team in the state, I don't know that that's a great, that says a whole lot about Cristobal.
Yeah. What's interesting is, as well as he's recruited down there, pulling top 10 classes his first few cycles, they finished outside the top 10 this year. Mm-hmm. And Florida out-recruited them. Like Mario the Pop-Tart Bowl didn't factor into this at all, but Mario with a 10-win season was out-recruited by Napier with a 7-win season, right? Obviously Florida won their bowl, but that was well after signing day. How did that happen, right? If you're Miami, how are you not improving on where you're at, and how are you falling backwards at this point? So I don't know. That's to me the one that Florida State certainly makes sense to not have anybody on this list. Yeah. Miami not having anybody is kind of damning.
Yeah, but what about also not appearing on this list? Ohio State, Clemson, and Georgia. And those are 3 programs that historically recruit the state of Florida well also.
Yeah, those are a little bit surprising to me because Clemson has recruited specifically the Tampa area, but all of Florida really, really well. Ohio State's done a great job down there in South Florida and really all over the state. And so for them to not be on, it's interesting. Clemson obviously didn't have the year they wanted. Ohio State, it is 1 year, right? It is 1 year in a vacuum. You had a few.
Clemson made the playoffs, right? Georgia made the playoffs. Ohio State made the playoffs. So even if you have a season that not as good as you wanted,
yeah, it is. And the other thing is, it is 1 year in a vacuum, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we did this over a 5-year span, certainly you're going to have some variation. But for this year alone, it is pretty telling that the SEC absolutely cleaned up, and Georgia not part of that. But 1 year in a vacuum, obviously you don't want to say like, oh, we'll extrapolate this out. It would surprise me if none of those teams we mentioned, Miami, Florida State, Ohio State, Georgia, like didn't get back into the list next year.
Sure.
Uh, but for a 1 year span, obviously the most credit to me goes to Florida, and obviously they had some ins on not only the legacies, but other kids too. But yeah, for them to, I mean, they were the worst team out of that, group that recruited all them people, and they still got the most out of the recruiting efforts. And so, yeah, I think the bigger picture is the SEC. All of
Yeah.
these kids signed with SEC programs, and I think that's where kids want to play. Like that's your best path to the NFL. I mean, all the stats are draft picks and top 5 recruits and this, that, and the other. I mean,
National
that is your
championship.
best path to everything, right? That's
Yeah.
the path that probably has there are outliers. Oregon does a great job. Ohio State does a great job. Miami, we talked about Miami. Miami does a great job with NIL. There are some programs that do really well with NIL, but for the large part, the NIL resources are the best in the SEC too. And so, yeah, when you're maybe getting paid the
But I
most,
think
when
it's
you have the most
also
success,
you can actually take a little bit less NIL money if you feel like it's much more of a guarantee that you're gonna have an NFL career, right? And I do think that sometimes that's some of the things that Alabama, that Georgia, that LSU, that some of those programs, I mean, Florida to an extent, but that those are what some of these programs can sell you is I've heard from sources inside Georgia on a somewhat regular basis, we convince kids to take slightly less money because we know that we can put them in the league and they know we can put them in the league.
I think that is true for some programs. I don't know if that's the case at Missouri. I don't know if that's the case
Yeah,
at
I don't think it's the case in
LSU. I think
Missouri.
LSU was like on this list a couple of times because they were paying up. I don't think that's the case at Texas. Like I think that is the case for some people. And I think like we talked about loyalty to the logo, I think that's somewhat dying too. Like Georgia's having to pay a little more this year than they did 2, 3 years ago. Like I think some of that's not, but I think that's a little bit of an aspect of it. But like, I mean, Javion Hilson didn't sign with Missouri because he thought he had a great chance of
Sure,
going to the league, right? Like,
sure,
I think that LSU didn't beat out Oregon for DJ Pickett because
right.
he loves the logo or whatever. Once like they develop guys for the NFL too. So I don't know. I think there is an aspect of that, but I think it's all those things combined. It's going to the
Yeah.
league. It's money right now. It's NIL resources. It's facilities. It's path to success. Winning game. People want to win games, and so I think it's all of it, right? And the SEC has all of that right now.
Hey guys, we appreciate you so much tuning into a peek inside SEC football. If you enjoyed the content, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss any new content heading your way. We are live every Sunday evening and we would love to have you join us.